At the outset, I would like to congratulate the ICHR for organizing this interesting conference on the emerging trends of Indian history. And today is a very auspicious day. Honorable Chairman Dr. Jamkhetkar has joined this morning, and he begins his journey with this grand conference with the big bang. And I wish you all success. And I would like to congratulate Dr. Aruni and his colleagues at ICHR for organizing this conference, and it is primarily a brainchild of Dr. Denino. And I believe that this conference will go off successfully. My sincere apologies. I shall not be able to sit through the entire conference, but I'm sure that in future the proceedings will be published, and if it is published, then I will be happy to contribute my article. It is a piece from my ongoing research. Those of you who are familiar with my writings, you know that I do environmental history, and in this presentation I shall be speaking on the colonial forest policy, and I shall try to examine the environmental impact and the disruptions that this colonial forest policy brought about in the Adivasi societies of India and in eastern India in particular. Now, this is the Royal Bengal tiger, Panthera tigris. It can be found all over the country. This is our national animal. It is well dispersed throughout the Indian subcontinent. And if you read the colonial literature on Indian forest, you will find that they are invariably packed with details regarding the tiger. The British and the tiger appear to be locked in a conflict. It's a conflict for mastery over the Indian forest. At one point of time, thousands of people died in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. Thousands of people would die because of the attack of the tiger. And the tiger was feared. It was looked upon as dangerous by the colonial writers, but at the same time, it was considered to be a very beautiful animal. Hector Munro's son was killed by a tiger in Sagar Island in the Sundarbans in the late 18th century. And tiger became a symbol of the Indian forest. The Indian forest also became an object of the thoughts and actions of the British rulers. The Indian jungle, the Indian vegetation was different from Western Europe, as you are aware. It was unusually tall, packed with unusually tall, woody trees. It is mystic. It was looked upon as mystic. It is something very wild. Indian jungle, it was jungle, not forest. Unlike the Western forest or wood, it was dangerous, but it was also beautiful. Now, British India played a pioneering role in the history of governance and management of nature. The modern forestry ideals and methods were exported from British colonial India to other British colonies like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, or Canada. Now, in my presentation, I shall try to examine mostly the complex process in colonial India through which nature came to be aggregated, exploited, managed, and governed between 1864 and 1947. Why another presentation on forest? We have a huge literature, growing literature on the forest. Now, the purpose of today's presentation is to show that colonization of the forest was actually an integral part of a much broader strategy of power, which aimed at imposing new cultural patterns and new sensibilities on the society. The present researcher seeks to throw some light on the question of the connections between the colonial state's establishment of complete governmental monopoly on the forest resources in India, with its primary agenda of timber extraction on the one hand, and the parallel endeavor of creating new categories like forest crimes or poaching on the other. The two projects were actually more interrelated or integrated in the broader strategy of managing the natural world in South Asia than they actually appear at first sight. In the course of the 19th century, the British government gradually restricted access to the forest. The British needed timber, first for constructing their great colonial cities and shipbuilding, and finally for the construction of railroad in India. The earliest measures to monopolize the forest resources were taken in 1849 when the Governor General Lord Dalhousie ordered certain wastelands for the creation of fodder, fuel, and forest resources reserves. The Imperial Forest Department, as many of you may be aware, was created in 1864, and the first Indian Forest Act was passed in 1865. Now, so the Imperial Forest Department came up in 1864, and this allowed large areas of forest to be demarcated as reserves, in which the government would have a monopoly right to all produce. The government was considered to have full right of ownership over these reserves. The Second Indian Forest Act of 1878 gave even greater power to the government. The act enabled the authorities to convert unoccupied or wastelands belonging to agrarian communities into reserved tracts, effectively depriving the rural folk throughout India of their common lands. As colonialism bashed in, the collapse of the traditional society seemed inevitable. The pressure of imperialism fostered the dislocation of the traditional socio-cultural patterns and the emergence of a new set of agrarian relations based on a fresh legal and administrative framework. Corresponding to the new set of agrarian relations and the relationship between the state and the people, a new rule of law became an objective necessity. To the Whig mind, the introduction of private property right in land and the maintenance of the same through a Western type of legal system appeared to be very urgent. Now, the thrust of Pax Britannica brought to the fore the fundamental conflict between the traditional socio-cultural perceptions and the new or comparatively strange codes of social, moral, and legal values. The forest was just yet another space where the two divergent systems came to clash. With the progress of the 19th century, the vast tropical rainforest in India turned into a site for the manifestation of colonial power. The new legal administration thrust upon the indigenous society, it was geared to generate a new social sensibility as to what would be crime, what would be property, what would be justice, what would be injustice, what would be legitimate, what would be illegitimate, what would be order, and what would be disorder. To demonstrate the colonial state as legitimate, it became imperative to introduce a system of direct supervision and stricter surveillance of the people. Therefore, it now seemed necessary from the colonial point of view to codify the law. run regular law courts, create a colonial police force, install a prison network, and reorganize the army on the sideline and make it ever ready for deployment in emergency. The forest and its dwellers. You need to control the whole forest, and if you want to control the forest and extract its resources, you also need to control the forest dwellers, the tribal people, the Adivasis, the Santals, the Kols, the Bhils, the Mundas, the Oraos. So, you need to have a whole apparatus of control. And we find that with the progress of the 19th century, the vast tropical rainforest in India turned into a site for the manifestation of colonial power. What worried the state was the kind of tolerated illegality that was known in the past. It all began with the process of codification of law. The force of Benthamite utilitarianism behind codification of law was of considerable importance. Bentham acted as a sort of Indian Solon to Dundas, the president of the Board of Control. His essay on the influence of the time and space in matters of legislation was composed with the object of considering what modifications were required in order to transplant his system of law codes to India. To the utilitarians, until men had sufficiently disciplined themselves, a severe schoolmaster was necessary in the form of law to ensure lasting happiness. Law was thus used as a mechanism of discipline, which assumed responsibility for and placed under surveillance the everyday behavior of the people, their identity, their activity, and even their apparently insignificant gestures. As discipline was to be a political anatomy of detail, the law was marked by remarkable meticulousness. It appeared necessary under the circumstances to supervise even the smallest fragments of life. It is against this background that the real significance and the motivation behind the Forest Acts of 1865 and 1878 have to be understood. In a single stroke, the government's claim over the forest became legitimate, and hunting, food gathering, or cutting of trees became illegitimate. The main group of offenses with which the colonial rulers were primarily concerned were hunting, wounding, or stealing of animals, and poaching, fishing. In this manner was created a whole new legal category of forest crimes. There was a progressive criminalization of varied forms of human activity within the Indian forest and hills, which were previously more or less unknown to law and the legislators. The legislators, throughout the colonial period, were constantly extending the boundaries of forest crimes through the popular perception of what constituted crime, though the popular perception of what constituted crime still remained very fluid. The colonial government's claim over the forest had to be displayed as just and legitimate. It is not enough if you only pass the legislation. In order to implement, in order to thrust upon the new legal mechanism, you have to create a social sensibility regarding the justness of the law. Therefore, it was extremely urgent from the point of view of the Raj to generate a new social sensibility as to this. The colonial rulers and their collaborators sought to build up this new sensibility as to the justness of their claim over the forest in various other ways too. It was imperative to project the ruling class as powerful and invincible. To foster this process of image building, organized shikar or hunting expeditions by the rulers appeared to be useful. While the new laws restricted small-scale hunting by tribal people, they facilitated more organized shikar expeditions by the Europeans. From the mid-19th century, there began a large-scale slaughter of animals, particularly slaughtering of tigers, in which white shikaris at all levels, from the viceroy down to the lower echelons of the British Indian Army, participated. But the arrival of white men on elephants with guns and hundreds of brown men with gongs, rockets, and torches had a remarkable moral effect on the minds and hearts of the ordinary people. It showed the strength of the white rulers who had come from behind the Kalapani, as the indigenous people called the sea with horror. The practice of exhibiting photographs and souvenirs of hunting expeditions among the white and later among the non-white ruling classes fitted well with the project of demonstrating the skill and the might of the shikari. So basically, what motivated the British Raj was timber extraction because they needed timber. The British Industrial Revolution was then in full swing in the 19th century. And timber was extracted for the construction of the railroad in India. Now, recent research has unveiled the fact that forest resources provided subsistence to the Adivasi or tribal communities in pre-colonial period. And many of these communities lived on a hunter-gatherer economy, and the forests or jungle offered them necessary fuel, food, grazing facility, and various other services, and these were used as free goods. So they had always access to the forest, and since times immemorial, they depended on the forest for their livelihood. The enterprise of state monopoly on the forest resources effectively deprived the rural folk and the Adivasis, the tribal communities like the Santals, Bhils, Kols, and the Mundas throughout India, of their main source of livelihood. Being deprived of their main source of livelihood, these communities had been contemplating resistance in diverse forms. And we come across a large number of peasant resistance and Adivasi tribal resistance in the throughout the 19th century. And basically, these resistance movements were a kind of protest. They wanted to register their protest for a protest against the monopolization of the forest resources by the colonial rulers. This is Birsa Munda, the legendary leader, and he is the only, Birsa Munda is the only tribal leader whose portrait is displayed in the central hall of the Indian Parliament. Now, state reservation of forest sharply affected the subsistence activities of these communities, the food gatherers and hunters who continued to evade forest laws, and they were in their own self-image legitimate hunters attached to their traditional occupation. But the alien law treated them as poachers or criminals. And the main group of offenses was that of, for which they were punished, was that of hunting, wounding, or stealing of animals. In this manner was created a whole new legal category of forest crimes. There was a progressive criminalization of varied forms of human activity within the Indian forests and hills. Now, we have to realize that in their own perception, in their self-image, the Adivasis were actually responding to their age-old practices. For example, some of you may be familiar with the communities who used to produce salt. Look at coastal Bengal. There were fishermen and communities, Adivasis, who would produce salt. Apart from fishing, they would produce salt, and this they had been doing since times immemorial. They had been doing it. They had done it in the past. They know that their forefathers do it, and it's a legitimate thing to do or produce salt. But when the company established, East India Company established, salt monopoly, in a single stroke, with the passing of the regulation, they came to be treated as smugglers, salt smugglers, illegal, illegitimate salt producers. Now, this is a kind of a cultural clash. They could not understand this. They could not grasp this conflict very well. They thought they did not understand why they were treated like this, why they were thrown to the prison. The same thing happened in the case of the Adivasis, who were earning their livelihood from the forest since the ancient times. But the legislators did not care. They were pushing the frontier of law to bring under the purview of law the apparently insignificant gestures which were tolerated in the pre-colonial past. Now, the colonial obsession with law and order and the strong urge to place the more sensitive communities under stricter surveillance led to the enactment of the Criminal Tribes Act. The Criminal Tribes Act was first introduced to control the Minas, a tribe of northern India, and a few other communities viewed as dangerous by the authorities. By this Criminal Tribes Act, the administrators were empowered to brand any community, caste, or tribe as criminal or dangerous. The act was revised a number of times in 1897, 1911, 1929, a number of times. And we find large demographic masses were branded as criminals. Sometimes entire demographic masses were branded as criminals. I give you one example. The examples can be multiplied, but because of shortage of time, I just cite one example. This example is from Tamil Nadu, interestingly. In Madras, the whole community of Piramalai Kallars of Madura was branded as criminals. Severe restrictions were imposed on the mobility of the members of the community identified as criminal. They were only permitted to be absent from their villages at specific times and allowed to reside only at places approved by the authorities. The coming of the Criminal Tribes Act was intimately related to the colonial forest policy. Little do we realize, this is a point which has been missed by the historians earlier, and there is a kind of silence. The historians have not probed this point very effectively, and silences and slippages in the writing of history always draw my attention. And this is why another paper on forest history. The coming of the Criminal Tribes Act was intimately related to colonial forest policy. There is a marked correlation between the dislocation of these forest communities and the introduction of the Criminal Tribes Act, which sought to pacify them. Thank you. So, many of the tribes, many of the communities were looked upon as dangerous, and repeatedly the umbrella of the act was expanded to bring new communities in the name of law and order. The coming of the Criminal Tribes Act was very much a result as well as an integral part of the colonial endeavor to collect systematic information about different aspects of the Indian society. This knowledge about the Indian subcontinent was not pure knowledge, but knowledge as a political weapon to dominate the subject people. Knowledge is power. Detailed information about the criminal communities was systematically incorporated into the contemporary works of H.H. Risley. Risley wrote on Bengal, Tribes and Castes of Bengal. R.V. Russell wrote on the central provinces, and E. Thurston, and many others. Besides these writings, information regarding the dangerous tribes and communities are listed in the gazetteers, different gazetteers of different areas of the Indian subcontinent. Now I am coming to the conclusion. I think it's half an hour now. Half an hour, so I conclude. 25 minutes. I told you that I'll conclude within half an hour. The colonial rulers' struggle for mastery over the forest was essentially a struggle to crush the law-breaking crowd of the hinterland. It became imperative to identify and discipline the dangerous people who remained unreconciled to forest laws and interfered with the changing pattern of resource mobilization initiated by the alien power. The new legal and administrative framework was engineered to develop a social sensibility as to the dangerousness of the forest outlaws and the justness of the colonial forest policy. The result was progressive criminalization of varied forms of human behavior that were previously beyond the control of the state. What was at issue was the conflict between two different perceptions of right, customary right versus an alien perception of law and order. In that period of tension, excitement and restlessness, violation of alien laws and regulations would draw the admiration of the forest folk, and even outlaws were made into folk heroes. Like King John, the legendary leader of the Hampshire forest, they too at times administered folk justice, and resentment of decades sheltered them. So basically, if we do a bit of forest history, we find the hidden story of the repression of the Adivasis or the tribal communities. They earned their livelihood from the forest, but in a single stroke, the forest was snatched from them by the colonial rulers. They were the legitimate users of forest. Adivasis were the legitimate users of the forest. But the colonial rulers treated them as smugglers and poachers. The colonial rulers were the smugglers and poachers. The colonial rulers were the illegitimate users of forest. They were trying to establish complete governmental monopoly on the forest resources with ulterior motive. And it is very interesting to note also that Britain's own forests were still in private hands. Hampshire forest, for example. In a period when the colonial rulers were trying to establish their monopoly on the Indian forest resources, precisely at that time, Britain's own forests were in private hands. And through this experiment, they were trying to construct a new way of managing the forest, a new way of managing the nature, which was never practiced before. Forests belong to the entire agrarian community. It is a great forest land, and in whichever direction you walk, according to the travelers' accounts, you will eventually enter the forest. And the forest now became the property of the state. And this model was tried in other colonies like Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. It is very strange that Britain manufactured this public control of forest. It is a German, you hear the voice of the German model of forest control, but in their own country, they stuck to the private control of forest. I stop here, and after this paragraph. So the governance of nature called for the systematic gathering of information about the forest and its dwellers. It necessitated the classification and quantification of both. So it was not pure knowledge, but knowledge as a political weapon. Thus, the entire method of the governance of nature was interconnected with the levers of the economic and political regime of the colonial state. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I am happy to take the questions.
Thanks, Professor Chakrabarti, for a nice, lucid exposition of a very interesting theme. Just to add to your story, a few more things happened. Following the Hul, the Santhal uprising in Chotnagpur, Bihar region, the British came out with series of Tenancy Reform Acts, reform quote unquote, the Santhal Parganas regulation and the Chotnagpur. So, but again, the main purpose, one objective was to isolate the tribal communities from the plain people. That's one. Secondly, this is the forest area, the captive forest area provided the raw material for the indentured labor. So end of 19th century, the coolies for Mauritius, Fiji, all these British colonies were picked up from the area. So this deforestation and extreme control of the forest paved the way for further impoverishment of the tribal people. So I thought probably this part of the next part of the story. Okay.
It is a comment. So, Dr. Mukherjee, it is a comment. I take it as a very useful complimentary comment to what I said. There is no question. Yeah, I did not get into that details. Yes, the Santal Pargana, it was separated, and the British came up with a special way of managing it. And of course, two very important developments were taking place because of this segregation of the Santals. One is the coming penetration of Christian missionaries, the conversion to Christianity, and the indentured laborers. Many of the indentured laborers were they were sent abroad, and they were treated very badly subsequently. Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to just add a little bit here. A lot of this deforestation was also to convert forest into cities. For example, take Chennai, Madras. It was originally known as Puliyur, or the land of tigers, the region of tigers. And it was totally deforested for two reasons. One, so that the British could see the French armies coming from the south. So they first started by deforesting the land to the south of Fort St. George. Then they deforested the whole area and totally destroyed the wildlife. The tribals moved out of that region. And the whole purpose was to create cities. And this was not just Chennai, not just Madras, but Bombay. All these were forest areas which became cities.
Absolutely. Even in the Mughal times, we find the clearing of forests. We are eating up. In the process, we have been eating up the habitat of the animals and the forest dwellers, depriving them. But it happened because of the population explosion. In the population of India, if we read some of the accounts of population, was roughly 150 million at the time of the death of Akbar. There was no census at that time, roughly 150 million, and it was expanding and very fast. So much so that in the 18th century, if we take 18th century into account, then the population increased to 170 million. So it is going to happen. It is very natural that new land will be cleared and new human habitation will develop. It has happened throughout Indian history, and this is one reason. Basically, timber was a driving factor. When it comes to colonial forest policy, they had in their mind the issue of timber extraction, how fast they can do it, and they deforested the entire terrain. So population explosion and the motive to extract timber, these two are the main reasons behind rapid deforestation. But this is bound to happen. India, if you read any traveler's account of the early medieval times, you find that it has been portrayed as a forest land. It is all the continent, subcontinent is under green vegetation, and in whichever direction you walk for some time, you eventually walk into the forest. So this you are right, absolutely, this is happening.
Hello. Thank you, sir, for a nice lecture. A simple question. I know you just covered up to 1947, but I have a simple question in light of the facts that you presented. What is the present?
I can't see you.
Sir, I'm here, sir. Here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So a simple question is, what is the present scenario? How is the government now handling the things? We know there are green tribunals established and all, but the laws, are they the same, or there are some amendments or something like that to undo the damage that has been done already?
Yes, I need, I'm afraid, 1 hour to answer this.
Okay.
But I give my very brief response.
We look forward for another session, sir.
Yeah, there
Thank
can
you.
be a whole conference in future on this issue, the contemporary issue or post-independence forest problems. Now we have joint forest management. We have the concept of sustainable development. We have the concept of scientific forestry. But you see, th- these are all very contested words: scientific forestry, sustainable development. Personally, I don't think anything is sustainable. Nothing is sustainable. Even if you take a printout, generate a printed letter, that may cause some kind of harm to the environment. You are burning some fuel, electricity. You are using the paper, and you are certainly causing some harm to the nature. Uh, but things are relatively better in the sense that the governance of forest is now in our own hands. The race issue is not there. The question is resource. The question is resource. Resource is limited, and we need more space. We need more resource, and you have the conflict still going on. Basically, by and large, we are following the similar forest management system, conservation and management of nature, introduced by the British. But within the framework of this colonial structure, we have brought in certain important things like community management, biosphere reserve. So that is a good welcome departure. But there is both continuation and discontinuity in our forest management. This much I can say.
So, I come from a state where last week an Adivasi was lynched in the name of having stolen food. My topic is a different one. So, my question is whether, as we know in Kerala, by 1790s itself, the Kuruchia rebellions and similar rebellions were in light. And don't we feel that, isn't it right that the resistance against the colonialist had started much before, right from, say, the second half of the 17th century or 18th century, and only the rules had emerged only a century later? Steps were there, or resistance were there on the part of different tribal groups in last quarters of 18th century, and in the beginning of the 19th century also, we see a number of resistance being there against the colonial uprising. But a systematic approach against this had emerged only after the as you said, in 1865 and 1878 and subsequently. So
what is your question?
The resistance, isn't it fact that the resistance against the colonial policies or colonial intervention had emerged much before the legislations had?
Absolutely, you are right.
Now the point is, you have stated that the main reason was timber extraction. Now for the railway, the main timber that was extracted by the British was a quality of a product called Vayana, Irul and Vayana. These were the main two gens used for railway. Now in addition to that, the main reason why the British wanted to occupy the whole forest was the extraction of land revenue. This is what this gentleman just mentioned, because in the case of Malabar, and especially in the case of Wayanad in Kerala, the whole territory wanted to be seized by the British for the extraction of land revenue. And that is why the Kuruchia revolt, as well as the Padashi revolts of 1800, which lasted for more than 10 years, existed. So that aspect also is to be covered. Because the land revenue, extraction of land revenue, because the lands were distributed or given in auction to the landlords. Whoever paid the highest bidder, whoever offered the highest revenue to the British, that portion was given. The whole lands, especially after the fall of Mysore, we find that the Malabar fell into the hands of the British, and the whole area was given to these kinds of people. And this resulted in a permanent clash between the British on the one side and the Kurichias or even the tribals on the other side. So that aspect, I think, more than this aspect, this should be emphasized because the British wanted to extract and exploit these aborigines, these people who actually lived on the products from the forest. Now there can be an example. Now recently there was a report that one Madhu was beaten up to death in Kerala, who was alleged to have stolen 1 or 100 grams of rice or 100 grams of chili. So the same case exists.
No, I have no quarrel.
Yeah.
I have no quarrel with your point.
No, this is an addition, that is all.
No, but I'm doing different thing. I failed to convey my presentation, my thesis. I am trying to find out the broader strategy of power, interconnectedness. You know, the British were trying to extract timber or they were trying to maximize their land revenue. This is well known, but you know, the creation of parallel categories of forest crimes and the creation of a whole legal mechanism, how they did it. The British could exploit the Indian agricultural system because they could introduce a new rule of property. Wherever it is in Bengal or in South India or in central provinces. So everyone knows that the British colonial rule moved in 2 gears. One, maximization of land revenue, extraction of agrarian surplus. This is 1 gear. And the second gear is maintenance of law and order at the minimum possible cost. It's my failure. I could not convey my research. You are advising me to look into the land revenue extraction. Yes, you clear the forest, then it becomes agrarian land. Their cultivation will go on. The soil tilling, there will be tilling of the soil, and land revenue will be extracted. So I am doing different thing. I'm sorry. I am trying to find out the philosophical and the technical sides of the introduction of the legal mechanism to maximize profit from the forest. Here I am concerned with forest policy only. Thank you for your question.
धन्यवाद सर, आपका पेपर मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा। सामाजिक चिंतन और इतिहासकार होने के नाते सर, क्या आप ये मानते हैं कि आदिवासी समाज से हमारे जैसे समाज को जो शहरी क्षेत्रों में रहते हैं उनको प्रकृति से जुड़ाव की सीख लेनी चाहिए? और वर्तमान में प्रकृति ने जिस प्रकार अपना रौद्र रूप कई रूपों में दिखाया है हमें, तो क्या इससे सरकार की नीतियों में जल, जंगल, जमीन और आदिवासियों के प्रति सरकार की नीतियों में कोई विशेष बदलाव आया है या आ रहा है? ये मेरा कोई प्रश्न है।
यस, एब्सोल्युटली। आप तो ये जो नॉलेज, इंडिजिनस नॉलेज अबाउट फॉरेस्ट, इसी को बारे में आप बात कर रहा है, ये बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट है। इट्स वेरी इम्पोर्टेंट एंड आई थिंक इफ़ वी डू फॉरेस्ट हिस्ट्री एंड इफ़ वी लिसन टू द वॉइस ऑफ नेचर मोर केयरफुली, today our keynote speaker, he mentioned about the importance of evidence. You know, the ancient period, for ancient history we use inscriptions and also numismatics, coins. We use various sources, the ruins. But little do we realize that nature can be also used as one of the sources. प्रकृति भी एक source हो सकता है, प्रकृति, nature. We have to listen to the voice of nature more carefully. So far we have not done this in our country.
Yes.
And environmental historians, they are pointing out now, Donald Wooster for example, he suggested that historians should listen to the voice of nature in order to rewrite history, to have a new explanation of history. This is a new thing. And regarding your second question, of course, yes, I think we have more safeguards in our constitution now for the Adivasis and tribal people. There may be slippages, still some slippages. We are fine-tuning it. We are all trying to do it. And I believe that in the coming 10 years or so, certain loopholes which still exist in the conservation of nature and about the right of the Adivasis will be able to further strengthen it. Thank you.
धन्यवाद।